Hello, eighth graders. Welcome to the next lesson for the novel Farewell to Manzanar by Jean Wakasuki Houston and James D. Houston. We are going to be reading chapter 6 today and looking at the questions that go along with that. So let's start by looking at the questions that you have that are in the packet, which is not in one of the folders. Remember, it's outside of the folders. All of the questions, chapter questions, are in one big file. So chapter 6, we see, explain how Papa's cane is similar to his own great-great-grandfather's samurai sword. So to make a comparison there, and they'll explain that within the chapter. Question 2, how did Papa and Mama meet? Why didn't her family approve of him? Were her parents right to disapprove of him? And pay attention that number 2 has 3 questions in there. So you want to make sure that you answer all 3 questions. Question 3, when Papa arrived in Honolulu at age 17, what humiliation did he face? So Honolulu, he arrived in Hawaii, not California. 17 is, under 18, he's a teenager. Humiliation is some kind of horrible event that would make him feel terribly embarrassed. Question 4, in Idaho, Papa worked for a lawyer's family. So completely jumping places. He wasn't, not even on the mainland, he was in Hawaii, and all of a sudden he's in the middle of the country in Idaho. Papa worked for a lawyer's family. What types of jobs did Papa perform? He dreamed of completing a law degree, but what stopped him? Once again, question 4 has multiple parts to it. Make sure that you're answering all questions. Question 5, although many of Papa's businesses failed, Jean still viewed her father before the war as a successful man. In what ways was he successful? How did his time at Fort Lincoln change him? I just want to point out the other pictures that you have on this screen. So we see here the pictures of the Japanese being loaded onto the Greyhound buses with all of their belongings. So in contrast, this is quite a bit different to what we talked about with the Jews being taken to concentration camps. Because although sometimes they were told that they could fill a rucksack and take a bag of belongings with them, quite often it was thrown away. They had to get rid of it. That's not the same with the Japanese. They got to keep the things that they did take with them. And they enjoyed going on a bus. I wouldn't say it was an enjoyable trip. I'm just saying they were not crammed into cattle cars. They were put onto a bus with reasonable transportation, although the circumstances are not necessarily the best. So we also see this picture of the command, Western Defense Command and 4th Army Wartime Civil Control Administration, coming from if you reside in San Francisco, California. This is from May 3rd, 1942, giving specific instructions to all people of Japanese ancestry. So that even the Nisi, who were born in the country and were considered to be American citizens, they were of Japanese ancestry. So this was applying to them as well. And I'm not going to be, it's kind of hard to even read this small wording in here, but you can see that they gave them a lot of restrictions. And obviously one of those commands was that they had to move away from the coastal areas, and they were put into the internment camps. All right, so hopefully you now have your book with you. I did get to go into school yesterday and lay out the books for all of the 8th graders and label them. So hopefully those were delivered to you this week, and you'll be able to follow along now. So let's take a look at chapter 6. And if you have your book, that would be page 47. All right, and if you would follow along with me, or if you wish to read it on your own and turn the video off, that is perfectly fine. I just want to make this available for those of you that like to read along with me. Chapter 6, whatever he did had flourish. That cane Papa brought back with him had carved and polished himself in North Dakota. When his limp went away, he continued to use it. He didn't need to. He liked it. As a king of swagger stick. I think that's a typo. I think it's supposed to be kind of swagger stick, such as military officers sometimes use. When he was angry, he would yield it like the flat of a sword, whacking out at his kids or his wife or his hallucinations. He kept that cane for years, and it served him well. I see it now as a sad, homemade version of the samurai sword his great-great-grandfather carried in the land around Hiroshima at a time when such warriors weren't much needed anymore, when their swords were both their virtue and their burden. It helps me understand how Papa's life could end at a place like Manzanar. He didn't die there, but things finished for him there. Whereas for me, it was like a birthplace. The camp was where our lifelines intersected. So we'll stop real quick to talk about the samurai sword and the cane. So if we go back to the great-great-grandfather, he had a samurai sword, but yet we can see that he didn't have much use for this particular sword. Instead, it's just something that represents who he is as a person, his values, his virtues, and it's also a burden that he has to carry because their family must have had use for a samurai sword at some time. So Papa, at the same point, he has this cane because he had been injured. And now he continues to carry that cane with him, even though he has been healed. So it's like a burden that he had at the same time. And he also uses it for his own purposes. All right. He was the oldest son in a family that had for centuries been of a samurai class. He used to brag that they had owned more land than you could cross on horseback in a single day. By the time he was born in 1887, they weren't warriors any longer. Japan was in the throes of that rapid, confusing metamorphosis from a feudal to an industrial nation, which began when Commodore Perry's black-hulled armada steamed into Tokyo Bay and forced the Japanese to open their ports and cities to Western trade. Papa's grandfather was a judge, at one point a magistrate for the small, lovely island of Miyajima. He had 4 children, including 1 son, Papa's father. His 3 daughters were among the first women in Japan to receive university degrees. One daughter married an army general who for a time governed Formosa, and it was this unclear general uncle general, who encouraged Papa to enroll in a military school. As far as everyone could see, he was preparing for a career in the Navy. Then, at 17, he abruptly dropped out. His favorite aunt lent him some money, and a short time later, he bought passage on a ship bound for the Hawaiian Islands. That was the last anyone in Japan saw or heard of him. In those days, he was a headstrong idealist. He was spoiled, the way eldest sons usually are in Japan, used to having his way, and he did not like what he saw happening to the family. Ironically, it foreshadowed or hinted just the sort of thing he himself would be faced with later on. Too many children and not enough money. His father's first wife bore 5 children. When she died, he remarried and 4 more came along. His father, who had been a public official, ended up running a tea house in Hiroshima, something like a cabaret. It was a living, but Papa wanted no part of this. In the traditional Japanese class system, samurai ranked just below nobility. Then came farmers and those who worked the land. Merchants ranked 4th below the farmers. For Papa at 17, it made no difference that times were hard. The idea of a tea house was an insult to the family name. What's more, their finances were in such a state that even as eldest son, there was almost nothing for him to look forward to. The entire area around Hiroshima, mainly devoted to agriculture, was suffering a severe depression. In 1886, Japan had for the first time allowed its citizens to emigrate, and thousands from his district had already left the country in search of better opportunities. Papa followed them. He reached Honolulu in 1904 with a letter of introduction to a cousin who taught school on Oahu. Papa used to tell the story of his first stroll through town just off the boat and wanting to stretch his legs before looking up his relatives. He came across a sign outside a building that said in 3 languages, "Workers wanted." Proud that he could read the English as well as the Japanese, he figured he'd have an edge over anyone else applying. He was feeling cocky. Anyway, on his first day in the new world, 17 years old and a little money burning in his pocket. He stepped into a men's shop a few doors down and bought himself a new suit, a new shirt, a new tie, a new hat. Everything he'd seen the most prosperous men along the street wearing. He changed clothes in the store, then went to see about the job. He followed arrows from the sign to the back of the building, where he found a yard full of half-dressed Chinese and Japanese field hands waiting in line to apply for work in the sugarcane. His disdain for them was met with laughter. They looked at him as if he were a maniac, pointing with derision at his dandy's outfit. He rushed back to the street, cursing, dismayed, humiliated, heading for the safety of his cousins. So let's think about what just happened here. So he wanted to dress the part. He comes from not necessarily nobility, but right below nobility as being of samurai family. So he's very proud. So he went with the money that he had and bought brand new clothes so he could go apply for this new job. However, it's just a field hand, and everybody else that's there, they dressed for the job that they're going to be doing, working out in the fields. So when he shows up all dapper, they really laugh at him, and it makes him embarrassed. So that is the humiliation there. A few weeks later, he was introduced to a vacationing American, a lawyer from Idaho, who offered to pay his passage to the States and provide room and board in exchange for 3 years' work as a houseboy. Papa accepted. It looked better than sweating in the fields, which was how most of his countrymen were making their new starts. And one imagines that the American mainland glittered for him the way it did for all those entrepreneurs and pilgrims and runaways and adventurers who crossed the Atlantic and the Pacific, hoping to carve out a piece of it for themselves. In Idaho, he worked as a valet, a cook, a chauffeur, a mechanic, a general handyman. He learned to roast turkeys and to drive a Pierce Arrow sedan, and he perfected the English he had begun to learn before he left Japan. In all, he spent 5 years with this family. Then his patron helped him enter the University of Idaho as an undergraduate, aiming toward a law degree. Papa used to joke that if he hadn't met Mama, he might have ended up as a senator. So the paragraph before what I just read up here, this lists all of the things that he did when he worked in Idaho. And what is the reason that he did not finish his law degree? He stated it right there in a joke. He met Mama. She was too pretty. Her brother Charlie once said, Ko couldn't leave her alone. She was the only Japanese girl in the whole Northwest worth looking at. I think there were 2 others around in those days, and they were both so skinny they could hide behind corn stalks. Mama's father came from a family of stonecutters around Niigata on the inner coast of northern Japan. But she was born in Hawaii, where her father had come to the back-breaking work Papa luckily avoided. A 3-year labor contract on a sugarcane plantation, 10 hours a day, 6 days a week, for $12.50 a month. Completing that, he worked his way to the mainland and set out with his 3 sons to find a piece of land. They settled in the rich farm country around Spokane in eastern Washington. In 1906, Mama and Granny joined them there. Granny was 30 then, Mama was 10. They sailed into San Francisco Bay on the morning after the earthquake and spent their first 3 days in America sitting offshore watching the city go up in flames. Her family had high hopes for Mama. She was their only daughter. In those days, Japanese women on the mainland were rare, 1 for every 7 or 8 Japanese men. Most men had to go back to Japan to find a woman or take their chances on a picture bride. Mama was worth a lot, and before she finished high school, they had promised her to the upright son of a well-to-do farmer in the territory. She met Papa early one summer morning in a wholesale market where her family sold produce. Papa was unloading trucks and wagon loads of vegetables. She was 17, small, buxom, with a classically round face of a kind which much admired among Japanese. He was 25, a sometime law student who spent his summers working around Spokane. He liked to shoot pool in his spare time. He played cards and dressed like a man from a much flashier part of the country. He was also pitching for a semi-pro baseball team called Nippon. We have a picture of him down on one knee for the team photo. In the front row, his mitted left hand resting on the other knee, his thick hair loose, his eyes showing a cocky confidence. His lean jaw bulges slightly, as if holding a small plug of tobacco in the manner of Ty Cobb, whose style was the one to imitate about that time. Mama's parents were terrified when they saw him coming. He not only led what seemed to them a perilously fast life, he also borrowed money. The story goes that he once asked Mama to borrow as much as she could from Granny. All Granny had at the time was a $5 bill. She gave it to Mama, who passed it on to Papa, who then came stalking into the kitchen, stiff-backed, glaring scornfully at Granny. He was insulted. "It's not enough," he said. $5? I need more than $5. If that's all you've got, I'd rather have nothing. And he threw the bill into the fire. The first time Mama ran away with him, her brothers came looking for her, brought her back to the family farm, and locked her in a second-story room. Mama was so desolate, her oldest brother, Charlie, couldn't stand it. He leaned a ladder up to her window, forced a latch, and let her out. That time they got away, got married, and made it down to Salem, Oregon, where Papa cooked in a restaurant, and she worked as a nurse and dietitian until my oldest brother was born in 1916. After that, she had a child about every 2 years, 9 in the next 18, and Papa kept moving, looking for job or the piece of land or the inspiration that would make him his fortune and give him the news he had hoped all his life he would one day be able to send back to his relatives. Wakasuki Co. made it big in America and has restored some honor to his family's name. Education mattered a great deal to him. In later years, he would brag to us that he went to law school and imply that he held some kind of degree from a northern university. It's true that everywhere he stopped, he'd be helping a friend through one legal squabble or another, an immigration problem, a repossessed fishing boat. He worked for the government at one point, translating legal documents, but as badly as he wanted to believe it, he never did finish law school. Who knows why? He was terribly proud, sometimes absurdly proud, and he refused to defer to any man. Maybe in training for that profession in those years before the First World War, he saw ahead of him prejudices he refused to swallow, humiliations he refused to hear. On the other hand, his schooling was like almost everything else he tried. For all his boasts and high intentions, he never quite finished anything he set out to do. Something always stopped him. Bad luck, a racial barrier, a law, his own vanity or arrogance, or fear of losing face. For a couple of years, he tried lumberjacking in Seattle. We have another old photo, this one from the 20s, that shows him standing on a railroad siding with his boots spread wide, one hand in his jeans pocket and the other holding a wide-brimmed hat flung high in boisterous greeting. A Nipponese frontiersman with the pine forest rising behind him. In Oregon, he learned a little dentistry, a skill he later put to good use at Manzanar, where he made dozens of dentures free of charge. He tried farming there too. The alien land laws prevented him from owning property, but he could lease the land or make a tenancy deal and work it. A few years before I was born, he had settled the family on a 22-acre farm near Watsonville, California, raising apples, strawberries, and a few vegetable crops. He was making good money, living in a big Victorian house, and it looked as if he'd found his castle at last. But his luck didn't hold. The well went dry. 30 years after sailing away from a financial dead end and the remnants of a once noble family in Japan, he found himself in the middle of America's Depression, and on the move again, with 8 kids and a wife this time. Working his way down the California coast, picking prunes, peaches, Brussels sprouts, sending his children into the orchards like any migrant worker's family, hoping their combined earnings would leave a little left over after everyone was fed and the cars gassed up for the next day's search for work. Just before I was born, he leased another piece of land in Inglewood, outside Los Angeles, and farmed again briefly, then deciding land was too risky for investing either time or money. He turned to the ocean, started fishing out of Santa Monica, and did well enough at it through the late 30s that by December 1941, he had those two boats, the Waka and the Nereid, a lease on that beach house in Ocean Park, and a nearly new Studebaker he had made a down payment on 2 weeks before Pearl Harbor was attacked. The start of World War II was not the climax to our life in Ocean Park. Pearl Harbor just snipped it off, stopped it from becoming whatever else lay ahead. Papa might have lost his business anyway, who knows? Sunk his boat perhaps the way Woody almost sank one off Santa Monica a few years later when he motored into the largest school of mackerel he'd ever seen. Got so excited hauling in the fish, he let them pile up on the deck and didn't notice water slipping through the gunwale slits and into the hold until the bow went under. If any single event climaxed those pre-war years, it was, for me at least, the silver wedding anniversary we celebrated in 1940. Papa was elegant that day in a brand new double-breasted worsted coat with vest and silk tie and stick pin. He was still the dude, always the dude, no matter what, spending more money on his clothes than on anything else. Mama wore a long crocheted rose-colored dress, and I see them standing by our round dining room table, this time heaped not with food, but with silver gifts, flatware, tureens, platters, trays, gravy bowls, and brandy snifters. The food was spread along a much larger table, buffet style, in glistening abundance. Chicken teriyaki, pickled vegetables, egg rolls, cucumber and abalone salad, the seaweed wrapped rice balls called sushi, shrimp, prawns, fresh lobster, and finally taking up what seemed like half the tablecloth, a great gleaming roast pig with bright red apple in its mouth. A lot of in-laws were there and other Japanese families and Papa's fishing cronies. A big Portuguese named Goosey, who used to eat small hot yellow peppers in one big bite just to make me laugh, and an Italian named Blackie with long sideburns and black hair slicked straight back, wearing black and white shoes and a black suit with pinstripes. These two were his drinking buddies, as flushed now as Papa was from the hot sake that was circulating in the beer and whiskey. Papa announced that it was time to carve the pig. We all stood back to make a wide half circle around that end of the table. He had supervised the roasting. Now he was going to show us how you cut up a pig. When he knew everyone was watching this, we were his audience. This dining room, his theater, he lifted a huge butcher's cleaver, and while Goosey and Blackie, trying not to giggle, held each side of a long cutting board beneath its neck. Papa chopped the head off in 2 swift, crunching strokes. All the men cheered. The sons, the carousers, the women sucked in their breath and murmured. 3 more strokes and Papa had the animal split. 2 sides of roast pork steaming from within. With serious face and a high-held final flick, he split each side in half, quartering the pig. Then he set the cleaver down, stepped back, reached behind him without looking for a towel, one of my sisters somehow there waiting, and as he wiped his hands, he said imperiously to his sons, "Cut it up. You girls, bring the platters here. Everybody wants to eat." That's how I remember him before he disappeared. He was not a great man. He wasn't even a very successful man. He was a poser, a braggart, and a tyrant. But he had held on to his self-respect. He dreamed grand dreams, and he could work well at any task he turned his hand to. He could raise vegetables, sail a boat, plead a case in small claims court, sing Japanese poems, make false teeth, carve a pig. Whatever he did had flourish. Men who knew him at Fort Lincoln remember him well. They were all Issei, and he was one of the few fluent in Japanese and English. Each morning, the men would gather in the common room, and he would read the news aloud, making a performance of it by holding the American paper in front of him and translating into Japanese on the spot, orating the news, altering his voice to suit the senator, the general, or the movie star. Papa worked as an interviewer there, helping the Justice Department interview other ECs. He almost became an alcoholic there on rice wine the men learned to brew in the barracks. And somehow, during the winter of 42, both of his feet were frostbitten. No one quite knows how. Papa never talked about that to anyone after he got back, but it isn't difficult to imagine. He arrived from Long Beach, California at the beginning of January in a country where cattle often freeze to death, and he, of course, was a prisoner of war. So this last part, just to remind you that when she switches and talks about Fort Lincoln, that's where he was taken when he was taken away. I want you to think about that, what she says that he's translating and sharing information with the other men who are there, who are mostly EC, meaning that they were all born in Japan. They do not have the ability to become American citizens. Papa, though, because he speaks English, is helping the Americans do the interviews. How do you think that will make the other EC men feel? What kinds of things might they start to say? How could that weigh on Papa? So some things to think about. Before we end our lesson for today, one last thing, let's look back to those questions and just make sure that we have an understanding here as far as what we need to do. So we talked about the sword, we talked about how Mama and Papa met, why her family didn't approve of him. Think of that tale that they tell about the money, the $5 bill. I don't know if that's true or not, but make sure you also explain whether or not you think they were right to disapprove, and that is your opinion, but you must support it with text details. That seemed out of order. I feel like we read this part about Honolulu before that, but maybe I'm wrong. Yeah, I do feel like that's out of order. We talked about the humiliation that he had, the things that he did when he was in Idaho, and what types of jobs were there. There was a whole long list of more jobs that he had completed when he was in all of those other locations as well. But mostly, if you just include that paragraph about Idaho, I think that's enough for you to cover. And then this last one, although his businesses failed, she still views him as a successful man. Make sure you point out all those ways that he was successful. What were the things that he did well, that she could point to him that he was a good man and had some strengths. And then how did that change in Fort Lincoln? So some of those successes, and that's some of those points that I talked about at the end there. And that's the end of today's lesson. And I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you tomorrow for the next chapter. Bye.